Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts. Hey there, everybody. Welcome to another Sports Psych Concepts presentation. Today, I'm going to dig into this topic of personality and how that ties into sports psychology or the types of things that we'll do. And in this recording, I'm really going to focus more on some of the fundamental background type concepts rather than digging into too much of the applications. However, I will talk a little bit about cognitive strategies and give you a few takeaways in that regard, because it's always important to make those connections of, well, how do we actually use the information and then go and apply it? So there will be some key takeaways on that, and I hope you get a lot out of what I present here. So to start, I want to just set the backdrop here in terms of what we're talking about. When I say personality, what is it that means? We all kind of have a general idea of what that is. Generally, right, it's just the blend of characteristics that every individual has that make them unique. It's what makes you uniquely you, or any athlete client that we work with. It's what makes them uniquely themselves. And so there's a combination of different things that contribute to that make up the person. People are dynamic. They're not these static beings. And so there's different models or perspectives out there that can be used. This one's from Reiner Martin's. It's adapted from that, but basically we've got these three kind of key central components. The first is like the foundational, that this person has this psychological core, which are just the most basic or deepest attitudes, things that they value, things they're interested in, what are their motives, right? Their sense of self-worth, just the real person at the core of who they really are. So this is the more internal thing. It's more constant. Yes, definitely shaped by their upbringing and the values, the type of home system that they were raised in. Maybe there's some religious background that has, there's beliefs that come with that, and that is their just sort of basic psychological core of how they view the world and how they interact with the world. Okay, so like I said, it's more internal, it's more constant, less changing over time. So if anybody listening is a parent, you see this in your children. There's certain elements of them that there's just the way that they are. They've always kind of had this certain temperament, and they carry that with them throughout their life. And yeah, of course, these things can be shaped and molded to some degree, but they're just less responsive to those things than other things. Okay, and so we have that element, and then the next one would be what is called the typical responses. So just the way that someone responds to a typical situation in the environment. So for example, if you have an athlete and their coach is kind of getting on their case, how do they typically respond to that? Are they receptive to the feedback? Does it cause a drop in confidence and they'll lower their head in shame? Or like what does that look like, right? So these are things that are more visible to the outside world. We can see these things, and it gives us a perspective on what their personality really is like, right? It gives us some information. Are they more of a happy-go-lucky personality? Are they more shy and reserved? What are the characteristics there based on how they typically respond in just general situations, right? Overall. And then we have what's called role-related behavior. So this is what you see where an athlete might look a little different if they're in a different environment, right? You see an athlete in practice, they may interact differently with you there in practice compared to if they run into you in the grocery store, they run into you in a school hallway or somewhere else, whatever the situation might be. it's how one acts in a particular social situation. Okay, so again, athletes that we work with in many levels, they're also students, then they're an athlete, they could be a friend, or they're around a group of friends and they may respond differently in those situations. It could be, well, if we're working with older athletes, maybe master's level athletes, as a parent, how do they respond in that situation? And the list goes on, right? So all of these are important and reflective of some of the things that are going on inside an individual that make up their personality. So as mental performance consultants, it's important for us to recognize that there's these different layers, and we need to, at least to some degree within the bounds of what our training is, try to get to the psychological core. We need to know what really makes them tick to help them be the best athletes or performers that they are. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning of that is what do they value? What's really important to them? What are they trying to accomplish in their life in the grander scheme of things, and how does their sport fit into that? All right, so now with that as sort of an overarching framework, what are some different approaches that we can use as practitioners to understand personality, to really dig into those layers that I talked about there? And this is not going to be an exhaustive list, but I'll go over some of the key ones to consider. The first is a psychodynamic approach, right? The sort of classic psychological perspective to adopt. And the underlying assumption here is that behavior, it's determined by mostly unconscious and constantly changing factors that often conflict with one another, right? So you think about some of the classic Freudian ideas of the ego, the id, and the superego, and how they can come in conflict with each other, and that results in maladaptive personality traits or behaviors, right? Now, if we adopt this approach, which really in the sports psychology space isn't as widely adopted as maybe in a traditional psychological space, even there maybe it's not as adopted as it once was. But the emphasis here is placed on, understanding the person as a whole rather than identifying just different isolated traits. Okay, is a way to think about that. But really digging into some of these things, unconscious things that are they really there, and can we validate them? And like I said, it's not really used as much in the sports psychology space. However, there may be some practitioners out there that would advocate for this approach. So it's good to be aware of that. The second one would be the what is called the trait based approach. Okay, and here we're just assuming that personality really is due to these traits that are relatively stable, that really predispose a person to act a certain way regardless of the situation. Okay, and so the a very widely accepted framework for this is the big five personality traits, where the acronym for this is ocean, right? OCEAN. So O is openness to experience, just how open someone is to trying things new, meeting new people, doing different things, right? So some people rate higher on the continuum for that particular trait. Now, all of these are all on a continuum, right? A spectrum that will go from high to low. So then the C is conscientiousness, just how dutiful someone is in the types of things that they do, and organized and trying to get things done. So that's the C. E is extroversion, which is on a range of from extroversion to introversion. And again, the way to think about this is just not necessarily whether someone is overly happy-go-lucky. It's just where they get their energy. Maybe you've heard that before. Is if a person who is more introverted, doesn't just because that is part of their personality doesn't mean that they aren't willing to go to large events or hang out with bigger groups of people. It just means that when they're done with that, they generally feel more exhausted than someone who is more extroverted. They feel like they've got this energy boost and it's a jolt, and they're on a high and it was awesome and they want to do it again. Okay, so that would be the difference there. So if OCE, then the A is agreeableness, just someone's desire to want to get along with other people and connect and have relationships, and that's what agreeableness is. And then the last one, N, is neuroticism, okay, which is someone's predisposition to worry. So someone who scores high on neuroticism tends to be more of a chronic worrier, right? We all have worries, we all have anxiety in different situations, but some of us experience more of that than others. And so if that's the case, we may have a more neurotic personality. Okay, now I'm not going to dig in too deep on these. I'm just introducing the ideas, but it's just one way that can help us understand someone's personality, right? Because we don't want to like totally pigeonhole someone just because we had one interaction with them and they seemed a particular way, and so now it's going to we're going to have confirmation bias consistently after that when we meet the person, right? Because again, we rank on a spectrum and there's different situations that might affect this, and that indeed is a good segue into the next approach, right? Because the trait approach is that things are relatively stable and constant in terms of we see this pattern regardless of the situation, whereas the situational approach is based on the idea that someone's behavior is really determined largely by the environment, right? So the situation that the person is in is more important than the personality trait of the particular person. Now, this one again is there's discussion on this, and maybe you could say there's some debate on the usefulness of it, depending on someone's perspective that they take. It's not a particularly widely accepted approach to understanding personality in the sports psychology space, and when I say that, I mean on its own, right? As if the situation is the only thing, because obviously the situation does matter, which leads me to the next approach, which really is kind of a blend of the trait approach and the situational approach, and we call that the interactional approach. Okay, so here we're saying, well, however an athlete behaves, really it's determined by the person, so the traits that they have, but also the situation. So they interact, right? There's this interaction between the psychological core and the typical responses that someone has, and then maybe there's these role related behaviors that come out in the situation, and that's maybe the best way to understand someone's personality. So this is a lot of sports psychology practitioners like this approach because it's kind of the best of two worlds on that. But there is more. So another one that I'll add is the phenomenological approach. So this one, the idea is that behavior is determined by, again, both the situation and their personal characteristics. So there's this interactional component, okay, but also the person's understanding and interpretation of who they are, or what their who they are as like their self concept and the environment. Okay, so it's not just a matter of like, oh well, person, environment, and then behavior. It's like person, environment, and then how are they interpreting that? What's their understanding of themselves in relation to that situation that they're in, that's then is determining how they're moving. So you hopefully you can see in the how that applies to sports psychology is there's this self-awareness piece, right? The self-awareness of who we are, and then what the environment's like, and then how those things interact. And then that leads us to the last approach that I'll mention here, which really is it's the integrated approach. Maybe some will call it holistic, or the biopsychosocial approach here. And really with this, we're to understand someone's personality with this perspective, we need to take the whole person into account. So we need to consider biological factors. We need to consider those dispositional traits and any types of adaptations that they might make to the situation that they're in. And then what are their self-defined or other defined life stories or narratives that they're telling themselves that are situated within their broader environmental or social context. Now, this one is more, it's newer relative to the other ones, but it does have pretty widespread acceptance because we're taking a more uh, again, integrative or more holistic understanding, or seeking a more holistic understanding of the individual to get a better picture of their personality, and so that can be particularly helpful. But like I said, there's many different approaches that we can take to understanding personality, but it's good to have some uh, background understanding of where those come from and how they interact and how we can use them to support our work with clients. Okay, so now I want to dive into a particularly relevant uh, manifestation of personality that we see quite often in different sport spaces, sports settings, right? That have this psychological element. And that is, of course, perfectionism, right? So perfectionism, we see that in athletes. It's a personality style is one way that we can describe it, that's really characterized by, if I were to define it, it's an athlete who sets really high, just extremely high standards of performance, and they're striving for flawlessness, right? No mistakes. It's perfect. And they tend to be overly critical in evaluating their performance, right? If you're listening, you probably think of different examples that you have come across in terms of athletes that you've interacted with. Maybe you've experienced some of that yourself. I know that I have at different times. There's levels, right? Everything we're talking about personality, it's on a spectrum here of what we are discussing. So there's those extremely high standards. This is something that we'll see in our athletes. Like, how do we identify this? We see that, and overly critical, not giving one credit, tends to be there are different ways that we can classify this. Okay, so the first would be it's self-oriented perfectionism, which this is just the degree to which one sets those high personal standards, and then they are stringently evaluating themselves relative to those standards, right? But it's self-oriented. So they're like, here's the standard that I've set for myself, and this is what I'm trying to ascribe, and I'm holding myself to a just vicious standard to meet that expectation, right? So that's different than socially prescribed perfectionism, where this one is basically the athlete or the performer, it's their perception that of the standard that significant others have for them. They're holding these high standards, and they're basically, the way they meet that is by, they get approval from those other people by meeting those standards, right? So it's different than the self-orientation where they're kind of setting the standard. They're really working hard to hold themselves to it. If it's socially prescribed, they're feeling like they're not going to be accepted by these significant people in their lives if they don't meet that standard. And so then there's this feeling of, I have to be perfect to appease my parent or my coach or whoever else, right? And so then we have other oriented perfectionism, where this one is, and sometimes you'll see this where an athlete will try and hold a teammate to the same standard, and they get really bothered if a teammate's not doesn't care as much, and they're just really hard on a teammate or someone else that they're working with. This could be a coach could be in this role as well. Like, a coach is projecting that onto their athletes, as this is the standard that you have to hold. Extremely high standards, and again, there's nothing wrong with high standards. It's just they tend to be very inflexible with that, right? They're very inflexible and don't always have the self-awareness of what is going on. And so we can take that a step further and look at that, which is kind of what I was alluding to, is that perfectionism, it doesn't, like I said, there's nothing wrong with having high standards. So perfectionism can be adaptive or it can be maladaptive, right? But the differentiation here is whether it's perfectionistic striving, like I'm just striving for perfection, but I recognize that maybe I won't achieve it, but by striving for it, I'm going to achieve something really, really good, a high level, right? Whereas you have this perfectionistic concern where there's this really high concern over making mistakes and how others evaluate us. Like, I'm concerned if I'm not perfect, that then there's going to be these social consequences most of the time. Whereas, like, no, I know I'm not going to be perfect, but man, I'm aiming for it because I want to see what I can do and what's possible. Okay, so this one is a very specific aspect of personality that I think is worth pointing out here. I know much more could be said on it, but that's all I'm going to share today. So now I want to share just a few more notes on personality that I think will broaden this back up, because I talked about some different approaches that can be used to understand it. But in the context of sports and exercise and performance settings, it's important to understand that, personality alone, it isn't the only thing. Okay, we can't just peg everything on an athlete's personality, because that gets back to the whole expectancy is self-fulfilling prophecy idea, where we're pigeonholing an athlete, and then we're blaming it all on that. We're attributing everything to their personality, when in reality it is more dynamic than that. Okay, and if we try to understand a personality profile of, say, like, if we're looking at athletes versus non-athletes, or we're looking at athletes that excel in one particular sport or are drawn to one particular sport compared to other particular sports, there still isn't really a single definitive profile for that that's going to distinguish there. However, there is some evidence that there are some personality differences in athletes in different types of sports, if you're looking at individual sports versus team sports. But it's very heterogeneous. Okay, truthfully, like, you see all sorts of different personality types excelling in these different sports, even though, because again, remember, everything's on a spectrum. So there may be some shift in one direction that captures a particular sport or activity, but it doesn't fully explain it, right? It's not a blanket statement for that. And then if we're looking between male and female athletes, right, we're not really seeing personality differences at that level. Because again, you think about what are the things that are required to succeed at the highest levels. Well, that's going to be the same regardless of whether you're working in men's and women's, or men's or women's sports there. Now, all that being said, I do want to mention one specific thing. And there are certain, if we're just looking at like exercise psychology now, maybe shifting a little bit from away from sports psychology, but we can link certain personality traits to certain types of behaviors, right? Or in even outcomes. So if you take extroversion and conscientiousness, those are both positively related to someone's involvement in physical activity. Whereas neuroticism, whereas maybe someone is more anxious or worried about how others are going to view them, then that is negatively related in that situation. Okay, so there's no definitive single personality profile on the grand scheme of things, but we can pinpoint personality traits in some of these areas, and link them up with different behaviors and different outcomes. So recognize that there is definitely nuance in all of this. Okay, so now, as I promised at the beginning, I want to share a few cognitive strategies, right? Or just some evidence to support that cognitive strategies can help these performers. Okay, so the first thing I want to say here is that there does appear to be a link between higher performing athletes, say overachieving high school athletes as the example, right? They tend to be more coachable, tend to score better on attentional control or concentration. They cope with adversity better, and better at using cognitive strategies than, let's say, average and underachieving athletes. So there is something there, right? These high performing athletes, and this is not a landmark sort of groundbreaking statement for me to make. Yeah, the higher performing athletes tend to use cognitive strategies more effectively than their under achieving counterparts. That makes sense, right? Now, So this link, though, again, it's worth driving the point home, is these cognitive strategies, they work, right, in superior performance in elite sport. And so athletes that may have certain personality traits that predispose them to certain types of challenges. Again, you think about a more neurotic athlete who's more anxious just in general. There's evidence to support that using these strategies can help them overcome these different challenges, and we see that in the top athletes in every sport. So how should we use these cognitive strategies, right? What are some of those strategies that are used by successful athletes? And this is a way to think about it, right? Is we know that we can enhance confidence, we can practice specific plans to deal with adversity during training. And so this clearly ties into the personality piece, because there's those typical responses, right? And so athletes, they kind of know how they respond to certain situations. They know kind of what the thoughts are that they have, what the self-talk is going on inside their mind. And so we can leverage that. It gives us a look into the type of personality that they are. Are they generally more negative? Are they generally more positive? It's just another way to look at it. And then how can we use different cognitive strategies to leverage that and boost confidence in other things, right? And using practice plans and all those other tools that are out there. And routines, pre-performance routines, practice routines, uh, pre competition, just overall routines, all of those things, we can use those to help those athletes deal with those unusual circumstances that may not face all that often. There's just different distractions, things that can derail them and cause this downward spiral. So all of those things are useful, and just helping them, concentrate on the upcoming performance and block out irrelevant events and thoughts that might be related to their personality. Okay, so it all ties in. Like the tools at the end ultimately are going to be the same. We're going to use goal setting. We're going to use positive reframing or cognitive restructuring, or some of the other tools that are out there, breathing and imagery, all of that, and we can tailor that to fit within someone's personality. But we need to understand, again, it's the self-awareness piece. I always say that's step one in sports psychology. And so starting with personality can be a really useful first step in then later adapting and individualizing these cognitive strategies. Okay, so to wrap things up, I'm just going to share a few thoughts on how, there's just a few takeaways, right? How do we better understand personality? And the first thing that I'll say is a point that I reiterated earlier, and that's we need to look at both personality traits and situations. So not just one or the other, but the interaction of those things, to make sure that we're not misattributing something that's happening to one or the other, right? Or something that it shouldn't be attributed to. So that can help us. We certainly want to be informed consumers. We want to be informed practitioners, right, in everything that it is that we're doing. So informed consumers in terms of how we're consuming the information and the types of things that we are observing and reading and studying and all of that, and having that proper backdrop of the interaction between personality and situations. And we also want to be a very good communicator. This is kind of an obvious thing, but this is what is going to help us understand what an athlete or performer's psychological core is by talking to them and listening and recognizing that there's these different layers and linking things together that they're saying, because we're really there walking along with them, being empathetic to their position. And so being a good observer is certainly a part of that, observing and watching what's going on. So is there a connection between what they're saying to us and what they're actually doing? Does their behavior line up? Is another important tool. And then lastly, we need to know about some of the different mental strategies that are available to us. So I just talked briefly on how that can be used and how it ties in, and per usual, much more can be said about that. I have other presentations where I dig more into specific strategies and things that can be used, but if we want to better understand the link between personality and those strategies, we need to have that broader understanding in both direction, which particular approach might fit this athlete's personality type. So I'll leave you with one final example on that, because I once had an athlete who I made a suggestion to be aggressive, and that word was too strong. It didn't fit with this athlete's personality. It felt too abrasive. This individual was pretty agreeable, rated high on agreeable in terms of personality, wanted to get along, was very conscientious, all of those sorts of things. And so aggressive was just too much of a word. It didn't align. And so I said, okay, well, how about being assertive? Right? How would you be assertive in this situation? And that was much better. It hit home. It drove like, well, I'm not an aggressive person, was the response. And so, okay, well, but you're assertive, right? Can you be assertive in this situation, in this competition situation? And that really hit home. Okay, so the language that we use and the type of strategy that we use, we need to match the athlete's personality. So hopefully all that's helpful for you. Thanks for listening, and good luck in your sports psych journey. Thank you for listening to this recording. I hope you learned something about sports psych, perhaps something you didn't know before, and maybe even something you can apply in your life more generally. If you liked what you heard, feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit my website at fairadvantage.com, or visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify.